My name's Reden. I've been doing what I do for, 5 or so years.
Can you hit the button?
Oh, yeah. Awesome. So, I worked with Ryan at Urbanbound. I think we were using Backbone and then React there. And then before that, I did a lot of Angular work. And then after I left Urbanbound for about a year, I did more Angular work, Angular 1. And then I went to Outcome Health, which was called Context Media at the time. And I was supposed to only be a Rails engineer there. But just because I really like JavaScript and not a lot of people there did, they put me on more of a front-end project. And so that project was originally using just vanilla JavaScript. We had a consultant agency that was helping us build it because we were understaffed. They brought up Vue, this new thing called Vue that they had used in a few projects in the past, and we were like, yeah, sure, we'll use it. This thing's going to be small. If this library doesn't work out, it doesn't really matter. That project turned out to be much bigger than we thought it was going to be, but thankfully Vue was up to the task. I was really impressed by Vue. Really easy to learn, the easiest framework I've ever learned, and it scaled with us the way we needed it to. In fact, our problems were always with Ruby and not with scaling Vue. Like, our front end was pretty big, but because we could use things, components and some other things that we'll go over, it worked out really, really well. So tonight's going to be a little bit different than how I usually have presented this in the past. Usually I'm talking to people who have less experience than I do. Usually I'm talking to people who are fresh out of developer boot camps or what have you. And so they either haven't had a professional job, or they have, but the only thing they've really done is jQuery. So usually I have a much more like intro kind of to JavaScript frameworks and Vue.js talk. In talking to Ryan, I get the sense that this group is a lot more seasoned than that. So I feel like I don't really need to jump into the intro to JavaScript frameworks talk with you guys. I certainly can if you want me to. But based on sort of the questions I got when I asked the question on the Slack group and stuff like that, I kind of want this to be, I'm going to go over some of the cooler points of Vue, things that like you're going to use every day, things that I think are helpful. And I want this to be more of a conversation than just a straight presentation. I'm going to show code and stuff like that. I want you guys to ask me questions if you have any, and if not, I will explain everything to the best of my knowledge for you guys. So with that, let's jump into it. So Vue.js is a progressive framework. Basically, this is all kind of lifted from their website. It was open source and developed by Vue. It has a core dev team that actively works on it. And so that's kind of cool for a completely open source project in that there's actually people dedicated to it. Alibaba Group is also invested in it heavily. So while it's not owned by a company, it has a pretty big company backing. Library is really tiny, 60K minify, 20K gzipped. And I think someone asked the question, why is it so small? And we'll kind of get into that. Similar to React, the core library is kind of just focused on the Vue layer, right? Like, kind of just wants to do that. It supports all ES5 compliant browsers, no IE8. What's interesting to me about it, and something that I haven't used React in a while, but something I remember about React, is that you couldn't really use it without needing a build tool, without Gulp or Webpack or something. Like, you need to compile it because of JSX. Vue, not so much. In fact, one of the coolest things about Vue is that you can write Vue code tonight and not bring in any build tools or compilers, and you're fine. And I'll show you that my first example is a local app that is not built. It's just straight HTML and JavaScript. And then Vue apps, they have a root instance. They're composed of components, so if you've done Angular or really any modern day JavaScript framework, you're going to be used to components. You're going to know what they are. It's the same. All of the ideas are the same there. You can have routes via Vue Router and a data store via Vuex, which is influenced by Redux and Flux, as well as Helm. So So the Vue instance, so every Vue app is comprised of Vue instance, root Vue instance. They attach to HTML element, they have a life cycle. This life cycle, all of these have hooks that you can hook into as they fire. And there's sort of a structure around what these Vue instances, these root Vue instances look like. Essentially, a root Vue instance, all it is going to be it's going to be this. This is a root Vue instance. It's how you make a root Vue instance. You're calling new Vue. You're passing it an option.
A little bit.
Zoom in.
Can you? Yeah. A little
Yeah.
bit. Thank you.
Yep.
Oh yeah.
Good. You're going to call new Vue. We've imported the Vue library just as a script tag. And then you pass it in an options object. This option object has a number of things that we'll get into in a little bit, but the first one here is L. That is the element that you're going to attach this Vue instance to. So essentially, this element could be anywhere in your app. You know, I've seen people make Vue apps that are just like a little side portion of their app. Maybe it's a little calculator that they made in Vue, and it attaches to some element in their app as a whole that might be using React, it might be using Angular, it might be just using jQuery. And this is how a lot of people, especially bigger companies downtown in Chicago, dip their toe into Vue. Morningstar is heavy into this. They make little Vue apps and applets and put them, in their products different places because they're trying to introduce Vue into their company, but it's a hard buy-in to rewrite everything in another framework. So this is how you can do that.
So that would be like a portal, those portlets they used to have. Is it the same idea?
Similar idea, yeah. So, imagine you have, we'll say Bank of America's website. You log in and you can see your account information. And we'll say that account information is here, and then you can see the details of your accounts. The details of your account might be a Vue app, and account information might be whatever else their website is made in, just because they're trying to introduce Vue and figure out how it could fit into their the way that they work. And so, if this is how you create a Vue app, if you look at the HTML here, so don't mind this quite yet. We'll get into that. But here's the div app that we're attaching that Vue app to. So you can just kind of see L attaches to app. And when we run this, you will see that index.html. When we run, if you were to open index.html in your web browser, what you're going to see is honestly nothing right now. This would not render anything if we ran it just the way it is, because there's nothing actually to render right now. So if we save that, and we got nothing, right? I just made nothing. So here's another cool thing about Vue that I'll dip into a little bit. It wasn't part of my presentation, but something to talk about. Vue has something called Vue Developer Tools. A lot of frameworks have things like this. What this does is, and you'll see, I'll keep this open so we can see what it does. Basically what this is going to do is show you the structure of your app. If you select a component, so root is technically a component, so root component. Any attributes you have on your app, I should say any data elements that you have on any of your components will show up here. You can see events that are firing, you can see what's in your data store via Vuex, and we'll get into all of that. So back to our app, cool. Now we know what a Vue app looks like. So say a root Vue instance. Now I need to get back to the presentation. And so let's actually look, I want to show you guys the structure of a more built out app. So we'll look at this one. Yes. So this is an app that I made that is basically a Vue.js point of sale system. It pairs with blog posts that I'm writing about, sort of an intro to Vue.js blog post. So if you look at this, we have our new Vue, we're bootstrapping an app. So we have L, now we have data. So when you bootstrap a Vue app, you can give it data. This is, you can think of the root Vue app's sort of its own data, its own sort of instance of data. Like this is what these are its properties, right? So these live on the root app. You can put anything in here. It's all an object. So the next thing you can have things called filters. Filters, you can almost, I always take the analogy of just like if you're used to Angular, if you know Angular had filters. I think React has filters. And basically all these are sort of helper functions that you can have live in your component. One of the things that Vue does really well is it really tries to turn components into like a single concern. If you have a component that is, say like this, it's a point of sale system component. One of the things I know I need to do is I need to format the money. Well, instead of making a whole other file somewhere with some helpers, a format money helper that maybe hooks onto this prototype of string or something like that, I can make a filter inside of this component if I know only this component is going to need it. And boom, there it is. Anybody who's editing this down the line, other developers, when they come in, they'll know where to look for this stuff. So Vue really tries to help you contain everything in its own single concern, not spread it out amongst multiple files. Although you can, there are ways to do that. More structure, you have computed properties, which basically all these do, they return, they usually just return a value after you've done some type of something to it, if you mutated it in some way. So if you have a data value, like this item named is a data value. And so, here it is, item name. When I fill out the item name and I want to get a new item, whatever this might be, it's going to return, it's like an object. I want to return an object with name of item name and a price of the item price. And so you can do things like this in Computed. We'll get into that a little bit later. You have methods, and there's a couple other things. You have those hooks that I was telling you about, the before and after created and all that stuff. But basically, this is the typical structure of Vue component in general. The root instance is just a Vue component. It's just sort of a higher level Vue component that will house all the rest of your Vue components usually. But they usually have, at the very least on a normal application that I've seen, they have an element, data, filters, computed, and methods. Sometimes props. Cool. So here, I don't know how well this is going to show up. I was worried about this. This is the life cycle. That didn't do what I wanted to at all. All right, so
use the in-app soon.
Where is the
Just hit present.
Don't think like a web developer, think like a user.
Yeah, well, it's hard to do that. There we go. So this is that lifecycle I was telling you about. So when you create a new Vue app or a new component, components do the same thing. They have a before and a before creating and created. You can hook into those. You can do things like maybe you need to fetch some data before this thing actually lives on the page. And when it's created, maybe you want to set that data to something. What's interesting about Vue is that you actually don't have to, that L option, you don't actually have to give it that L option. Vue is unique in that it supports render functions and JSX, as well as its own things. And so if you don't want to give that L function, you don't have to. You can give a render function. You can also give it a template attribute and replace that L with template and give it an HTML template. And it'll be happy to find that and parse through it and replace it on the page. Something interesting to note is that Vue needs to have, the DOM has to be ready before Vue actually does anything. So the DOM has to have rendered before Vue actually kicks in and tries to bootstrap anything, which I think is pretty standard for most frameworks. Then you go down the line, mounted. I think this is probably the most interesting thing when it comes to actually working with the Vue app or any application really, is the sort of virtual DOM cycle. So Vue uses a virtual DOM similar to React and Angular. I think in React we call it the shadow DOM, which is basically almost if you're used to, I always like to think of it as version control systems. If you have your diffs, so you have the real DOM, and you have your virtual DOM, and if something changes on the virtual DOM, it diffs it to see what changes. It only tries to update what changed, right? So this is this cycle in Vue. Vue has a reactivity hooks that hooks into everything. One of the interesting things that means is that unlike React, which you have to, in React when you're making components and child components, if I recall correctly, in React you have to tell the child component that it should update, I believe, when the parent's data changes. Otherwise, it'll try and force an update all of the child components, even if you only change data on one of those components. You have to do this manually in React, that's fine. Vue just decided to take the opinion that you'll always want to do this, and so it's built into every component that it will always update when, or I should say, it will only update if you change data that it is concerned about. So if you have, the practice, if you have a bunch of components that are nested, you have parent, child, grandchild, great-grandchild. If you change data on the child and it doesn't affect anything down the list, only the child will re-render, the parent won't, and the grandchildren will not re-render. Similarly, if you just affect something on the parent and it doesn't affect anything down the list, only the parent re-renders, which is actually pretty good.
I don't know what the heck happened.
Getting excited. It's pretty cool. Like, that's something pretty cool that it does, because you don't have to worry about, well, I have this whole dependency tree down the line, and if I update this thing, it might actually cause the site to slow down a little bit because it's trying to re-render everything else. He was pretty smart about that. I have to, let's see. So I want to pause really quick because I feel like I've been going pretty fast, and I also need to figure out how to unzoom. Ryan, do you have any?
Go to the view menu.
There's a zoom out at the bottom.
I want to ask if anybody has any questions or wants me to go over anything or explain anything further, because I feel like I've been zooming through this. No? No, I haven't touched too much.
I have one. You mentioned that instead of a designated element, you can give it an actual HTML template. Do you mean a template tag, like HTML5 template?
Yes.
Okay.
That is certainly one way that you can give it a template. I will show you that in this section.
So I had a question. You showed a skeleton that had the filters and the methods. So what's the difference between a filter and a method?
Okay, so a method is probably exactly what you're thinking it is. It's something that it's a method. It's something that you call, right? It's function. And a filter is also a function. But a filter is something that you would pass to an HTML element to transform, say, the data that you have that it's rendering. So think of an H1 tag, and you want to make sure that whatever text is in it is always uppercased. And so you can give it a filter, an attribute of this filter, and, or I should say, all right, let me back up really quick. You have the H1 tag, you're rendering some text via mustache brackets, is what Vue uses. In these mustache brackets, you have H1 text. You can pipe it into a filter to upcase that text, and it'll return, whatever it returns will be what is rendered inside of that H1 tag. You can do this with a method. The difference is filters are wired to auto-detect changes on whatever that data is that is rendering in that H1. So if you update, say, the text that H1 is from hello to world, the filter will rerun on the new text. It'll just automatically do that. You don't have to recall the method like you would if it was just like a method. So methods are just basic functions. I mean, they're what you write day in, day out. Filters have a little bit more reactivity built into them. Anything else? That answer it? Cool. All right, so next is Vue templates. So Generally speaking, when you run into a Vue app, you're going to see that they use HTML-based bases template syntax, which is like that HTML5 template, like you were saying. This allows you to combine the render DOM to underline Vue instance data, and it's also going to be, it has to be valid HTML. Unlike React, where you sort of have that JSX and you have some interesting things you can do with the HTML. We'll say specifically when you're looking at CSS classes and you have to use class name as opposed to class, right? You don't, unless you're using JSX in Vue and the render function and stuff like that, you don't have to do that. It actually is just straight HTML, which is cool because it makes it easy for anyone to pick up who's maybe not used a framework before. And I'll show you that next section. And so this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. Vue's able, based on its reactivity system that they have built in, on the way that things are wired up, Vue intelligently figures out the least number of components it needs to re-render. It needs to re-render, and DOM manipulations it needs to do when you update things. So when I say update things, you could have a message stream coming from a server, and as things are updating from this message stream, Vue will figure out only what needs to be updated and only render that. It will not try and re-render anything else unless it has to. Again, this is really great for performance. And so let's see what all these different types of Vue templates look like. Not here. There we go. So you can certainly just have, like we have here, an L and an index, just have it attached to a div, and you write all of your HTML inside of your index page or whatever HTML page it is. You can certainly do that, that's fine. You will be happy to do that. You can also do something like this. So here we are registering a new Vue component, which I believe is the next section. But basically, this is the same as an instance. Like root instance is a component, and a component is a root instance. The root instance simply is special in that it houses your app. But here we're passing it a template, and we've given it a string that's just some HTML. That's one way to do it. If we look at components, this is another way to do it, where you can give it a template and just pass that string directly in. You typically won't see this just because it's unwieldy, usually just because unless you have something really simple like this example, most components are a little bit bigger than this, and so having a string in the template like this is probably going to be a little bit nasty to look at.
Is that what you typically bring in a build system?
Yes, because the other way that you can do this is, and I will show you what it is in SRC components. Is this? This is a .vue file, and this is sort of the answer Vue has to JSX. .vue files kind of look like an HTML file does. You have template, right? You have your script tag, and you have your style tag. This is probably the coolest part of Vue when it comes to the way that it's set up. This is just straight HTML, right? There's nothing special here. If I wanted to give this a class of something, I could just write, class equals, and that'd be fine. This is JavaScript, and that's good. And this is CSS. Great. You do need a build system to compile this down, because otherwise it wouldn't know, the browser wouldn't know what to do with this. And when Vue compiles this, basically, the first thing it does is it builds sort of an index HTML where it plugs in all of these templates into where they need to go. So if we look at the index here, these hello components, build component, would map to these components. In this case, we'd have one called app. And when the browser kicks off, it's going to plug everything. Well, I should say, when you build it, it will plug everything into an index HTML the way that you want it to render based on how you set it up. It's going to extract all your scripts and put that into a script file. It'll extract all your styles and put that into a style file. This is very, very powerful. Specifically, well, one of the things that's powerful here is style. You can scope styles. Scope styles they only affect the component that they're in. So that means that I could have 18 different components that all have a div with an ID of app and style app in some different way. And as long as I say that they're scoped, then whatever those components, their app style will only affect the app in that component. It will not affect anything else. The way that Vue does this is that when it compiles it down, when it builds it out, it's going to wrap any classes that you give it with something, like a app, and then it'll say something like data and like a nasty little GUID or something like that, and that's how Vue kind of gets around that. But that's actually, that's one of the coolest things I've used. I use it all the time because I usually forget what my CSS classes look like, and I hate having giant CSS folders. The other thing that's good about specifically styles is that you can pass it almost any preprocessor you want via the lang attribute, and when it builds down, it'll know what to do with this and know how to compile it. The script tags here are fully ES6 compliant, so you can do everything that you would want to do in new JavaScript in it. These are all exports, and sort of where we bootstrap this app, we're going to import everything and tell it components is app. So what's interesting here is that we import the app, we tell it what its components are, and say that it has a child component of app, and then it knows to render this. I'm going to pause here.
So if app depended on foo and bar, you wouldn't need to say foo and bar in that file you're just in. It would know how to do that dependency resolution. So if you go back to your other file.
So you're saying in here.
Yeah, so you in that components array hash or hash?
It's a hash.
So you just have to list like the second level components, right? You don't have to list like all possible component the app uses.
Correct. So yes. So if foo and bar were needed for app, if foo and bar were child components of app, I don't need to list them here.
Okay, cool.
I would list them in app actually, in the same way that I listed it there. I'd have a components. You do the same thing. What's another one of the things I like about Vue is that it's really repetitive, and then you'd have foo and bar after I imported them here before the export, obviously. But if I needed to have foo and bar before app, then I would actually import those in main.js, and then inside of foo and bar, I would import app. And so you have that parent-child relationship going on there. Any more questions?
Does everyone understand the shortcut syntax with the hash?
Yeah, this is basically this. It's the same thing, just JavaScript ES6, I think, decided to say, we don't like all that typing, so we'll let you shorten it if your key is going to match the same name as your value. So, let's see where we are. I don't have an example of render functions in JSX because I've actually never worked with that, so I don't know how to write those. I've never even worked with those in React. I left Urbanbound a little bit right before we really started getting into that.
What kind of templates do you usually use?
What kind of templates?
Yeah.
So when at Outcome, the project that I was on initially, we used I guess you would say the old style templates. So the old style would be the globally registered templates, which are these. So when you do this, thanks for that question. That reminds me about explaining one thing about components. This way to register a component, so we're registering a component that's going to be called hello component here. We're doing view.component. This registers this component as a global component, which means it moves it into the global space. What this means is that you can use it anywhere in your app, and it will render just fine. So that means that on this page, I have this hello world. I can use this here because I've globally registered hello world before I bootstrapped the app. And that's how we did it. That's how we did it prior to, I would say, the end of last year, is that we globally registered all of our components so that we can use them wherever we want. The other way that you can do it is locally registering them or registering them as children. So the way that you do that is inside of here, which is here. Similar to what we did in prior example, where you give it components, and I'd say, hey, here's my child component. I just made another template up here called child, which is an object with, basically what I did was make an object with the options that a Vue component would have. And if I pass it into the components here, Vue knows how to bootstrap this and turn it into an actual component. What this means, though, is that I can only access this world component inside of the hello component as a child. I could not access it in a Foo component if I did not have it as a child. As a child's Foo component, Vue would throw an error because it couldn't find the element. It wouldn't know what I'm talking about. So the way that we do that, so components, we've kind of jumped into them. I actually have a section. You write reusable elements with them. They have to be registered before the root instance. This is kind of important, especially if you're registering global components. What I mean by that is that you have to include them before you include whatever it is that bootstraps your app. Otherwise, it won't know about those global components. They haven't been registered yet. So as it tries to do whatever it needs to do with them, it's going to throw an error. Order of operations. Components have the same life cycle that I showed you in that root instance. That same life cycle, this diagram, applies to Vue components. It's the same diagram. And you, again, have hooks into each step of the life cycle. And components can have a parent-child relationship, and the way that this functions is that data goes down and events come up. So what I mean by that is, if you have a parent component, like hello component here, this parent component has this data called child word, McHenry. I'm passing this word down to the world component, this word down to the world component. I'm accepting it as something called props. Components can have something called props, which basically means that these are properties I'm passing to this component to use. I'll get into that in 1 second. And I want to render this word, whatever I get passed in this div, great. If I, in the child, wanted to change the word that's rendered here, this word, I cannot directly change it on myself. I have to tell my parent that I want to change it and tell it what I want to change it to. So basically, you have kind of a message bus going between children, parents and children. So the parent says, here's the data. When the child wants it to change, the child says, hey, can you change it to this? And then the parent will say, cool. It will update its data and fire off an event, basically letting anyone know that's looking at whatever child word was. It will tell it, hey, I changed this. This is the new value, and it will update it. So I want to show that sort of in action. All right, so there we go. Hello, McHenry. All right, so I don't know. Let me put a text box there, which I could do. But first, here, if I change this to our typical world. Save it and refresh that page. Full world. So it's data's going down. If I oh, I do have an example of this. So this is Vue.js driver.
I'm a big fan of yarn.
You are, you're not?
I am.
Okay. I like yarn a lot too.
It's finally arrived. Like, here you have NPM. Or, sorry, we have a bundle.
Yes. Yeah, right. Okay, cool. I actually have a pretty good example of this here. And I'll show you a little bit more of the tools. The dev tools. So this is what I was talking about a little bit earlier, where the dev tools show you your root app, and then actually, what's nice, I don't know if you can see it, but it's actually highlighting the way that the inspector would when you're hovering over elements in the inspector. It's highlighting actually what the entire component is that I'm hovering over. And so in Hello World, I have we have this counter. This counter is in another component as well. That if I take me somewhere, we have the same counter here. Go back. If I click me, it's going to increment the counter. This is using, well, I'm using JavaScript, but this is basically firing off events, saying increment this counter. If I go to this other component, the counter is going to be the same because it's using the same data. If I change this to 30, submit, I go back. Basically what this is doing is just using that data down, events up. Messages are great. So they can be registered in two different ways, globally and locally. So they hold data in several different ways. So we've seen data, and I think we've seen props and field props. I'll go over sort of what these are. So properties, kind of like I was alluding to, properties in Vue, on a Vue component, really are what you're going to pass into the component. What it's accepting, what it's expecting from its parent. So usually we'll only see props. In fact, I've only ever seen this key props used when the component is a child of something, will be a child of something. And that means that now I know that this component will, I can pass into it, I can give it a word. Whatever that I can give this, right? This word can be anything. It can be a string, it can be a data attribute on its parent component, it can be whatever. What's kind of cool is actually you can check the type of whatever it is you're passing into the component. So this accepts all of the base types in JavaScript plus two more that I can't remember. And if the type is wrong, if I pass in a Boolean and not a string, it would throw an error. You would say, I can't do this, you can't do this, I'm sorry. You can give it a default value. So if you don't give it a word, if I just wanted to render this world component without actually passing word in, you can give it a default. The default can be whatever the data type is. You can also have a function there that does something and returns something. You can also say that it's required. Doing this means that if you try and render this component without giving it a word, it will, Vue won't let you, it will break. If you say it's required, you can't give the default, because that kind of defeats the purpose. And you can do this with, you can have any number of properties. Properties can be kind of nested, but not very. When I say that, I mean you can't really do this, and say that, okay, I know that inside of Word I need text and blah, 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 blah. It's not TypeScript like that. This is more sort of light checking what you're passing in. So you can say, well, I know that Word needs to be an object. And if Word's not an object, it will say, hey, Word's not an object. We can't build this. Sorry. So this helps you a little bit, but it's not, you can't lean on it to do type checking, strict type checking. So let's see. Those are props. So then there's computed props, which we have somewhere. Computed. So computed properties are data that they're not. Computed properties are things that you've run some sort of operation on, some sort of mutation on, and you're returning the result of that. Or you've run a check on, a Boolean check, and returning the results of that. Computed properties, they're computed. They're based off. They're kind of like watchers. You tell them what you want to look at, and when that thing changes, it'll recompute itself. So in this here, receipt empty. Basically, we're saying if receipt length is equal to 0, well, return that. Basically, return if that, whatever that is, true or false. Anytime receipt length changes, it's going to recompute this receipt empty computed property and update that wherever it is, whatever's looking at it. What's nice about this is that these values are cached, actually. And so they only recompute when they need to, meaning they only recompute when whatever they're watching changes. They don't always recompute. They're not sort of long polling, they're reactive. So another example of this is that computed properties, similar to JavaScript objects, can have getters and setters. And what's nice about this is, so new item here, I believe in this example, in this app, you can create a new item, and an item has a name and a price. And when you create a new item, the way that I set this up is that you visually just say, new item equals this, which is whatever val is, and that calls this setter. And then setter sets the name and the price to whatever val is. If val was an object, I could say val.name, val.price, if I know that val is an object. But basically, it's a setter. Item name and item price are not new item. They are data attributes on the Vue component. And so this specific one is just going to be setting these to whatever this is, which is a blank. And then we have a getter, which is returning an object that is item name and item price. And so these are pretty powerful, but I mean, most frameworks have something like this. The thing that I found that's really interesting about Vue is that these are very, very reactive. They only update when they absolutely need to. Otherwise, it caches the value, meaning that the first time this runs, as long as receipt length is not updated, you've not added something to the receipt, anything else that tries to access this after the first time it runs will get whatever the cache value is. As soon as this changes, then it'll update everything else that's trying to access it, and anything else new that comes online that tries to access it will only get the cache value. It will not rerun it every time something says, hey, give me if the receipt's empty or not. And so those are computed properties. And then there are, okay. And then there are methods. Methods are just functions that you call, like anything else. These are not, there's nothing particularly special about these from the other functions that you ever write in JavaScript. They're not particularly reactive, meaning that they don't watch any sort of data attributes and then update themselves or call themselves based on if item name changes. You have to call these like you would any other function manually. But this is sort of usually where you put the meat of your component at, is in these functions.
So do you have an example of where you would, so you get the new item and then you think, well, how does that get used?
Yeah, sure. Yep. So inside of index. All right. So let's move on. So Vue has some built-in helpers here, so you can hook into the click event of pretty much anything by calling @click. When Vue looks through this file to wire itself up and it sees @click, it knows that basically it's going to hook up to the onClick event of an element. Similarly, Vue has vModel and stuff like that, and that basically says that I want to set up my data binding to whatever item price is on the component that this particular template is tied to. And data binding in Vue is one way, meaning that when updating, you update the data on the component itself and not on the, if anything else updates the data, not on the component, it will not update the data in the component. Don't know if what I just said made sense, but seeing if you're newer there. Here's that example for add item, so receipt. So let me dual pane this. All right. So new item. Add item to receipt is a method down below we saw it. We pass it new item. So where do we get new item from? Well, we get new item from here. And new item, when you reference it this way, it's going to call it getter, right? And so in this case, the getter returns this .item name and this .item price parsed as a float. Well, before we click this button, presumably we've entered in an item name in this input and an item price in this input. Those are tied to this data attribute and this data attribute.
So this is where the Vue model lives.
Yep. So the Vue model in this case is hooked up to these guys. And when you update this input, because we've tied in to the Vue model here, it's going to know to update these guys. And I will show this. I can show this in action. And so when we call new item here, that's what we're getting. We're going to get an object with whatever we've entered in here, and we'll add this item to the receipt. Where we call set is, I want to say, inside of add item to receipt. Yep, here it is. So the way that I got around clearing out whatever was in here after we add it to the receipt is that I just set new item to an empty string. And thanks to our setter, we can say, okay, cool, so item name and item price are just whatever we pass in the val, and we just saw that we passed an empty string. We set new item equal to an empty string, so new item and item price will be an empty string. See this in practice.
So you said there was only one-way data binding, so if the controls, the inputs are now tied to this item name, this item price. If you change those to null, is that reflected in the controls then, or do you have to do another step?
You're correct. It's two-way data binding. I was thinking of Vue has you can hook into the value property as well as an input. So how you could say value equals whatever, and that is one way, meaning that changing. So if I did value, or you val equals, something, whatever. Say that item. If I tried to like go and inspect the element and change value here, item price would not change based on that. I got the two mistaken.
But Vue model was a two-way binding.
Vue model is the two-way binding.
Okay.
You typically won't see people using value. I think that's a holdover from earlier versions of Vue before they implemented Vue model, and I think they just kept it in because, I don't know.
Well, that makes sense for control.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about Vue model is that Vue model also hooks into value and sets up the initial value for you and then disregards it afterwards. So I've never had an occasion where I just wanted to use value. I guess I can think of occasions for it, but cool. All right, so inspect. Because I can actually show you what's going on here. This particular app hasn't actually no components, it's just a root instance. Can I zoom into kind of? Well, alright. So, alright. Item name and price are nothing, right? So, watch these guys. What's really cool about the Vue tools is that they're all real time. And then item price, $9.99. So if we look at receipt is nothing. And here we go. And then our new item, right? Remember the getter for new item, which is what this is representing right now, will return an object with name of item name and price of item price. And so that is representative of what's happening right here, right? And so when I hit enter here, what we're going to see is that these are going to clear out. These are going to clear out, and when we look back at receipt, there should be something in there. Cool, so those are cleared out, something in there. Those are cleared out, and empty string is not a number, so that's fine. So that's sort of that in action, the way that the getters and setters and computer properties sort of all work together with, say, models and how you can sort of use them all together. Once you start to use Vue a little bit more, this becomes very essential to how you decide to build your components and your application as a whole. So, we're over time a little bit, I think. So I want to get to, which is actually interesting because I think I've...
So, just a question on that.
Yeah.
Point of sale, we're using a build tool to make that?
Nope.
Or that's,
That-
you made all that without using a Webpack, let's say?
Yep. So that's what I wanted to make sure I got to that as well. That is this Vue app here. And this, you'll notice, so I have a couple other apps in here, and I will expand. Vuex Vue Router. This Vuex Vue Router is using a build tool. You can see I've got a build folder here with my Webpack stuff on here and everything. This one, this Vue app, which is what this is a part of, this point of sale system, is 3 files. It's a style file, JavaScript index that includes some stuff, and a library file, which is Vue. I just included Vue. You can also include Vue via CDN. And that's what it is. And I was able to build that app, and I could do much, much more. I could actually, because that app is supposed to be simple, it is. If I wanted to have components in that app, I could have components in that app. I don't need to build any of that at all. It can live by itself. You don't need a build tool for any of that. So basically, one of the more powerful things about Vue is that you can just use it. there's no setup really involved besides just similar to jQuery, including the library, and then you're off to the races.
On the jQuery question, you mentioned a filter might do uppercase. So for my filter, could I call a jQuery function? Or do people not do that? Or?
No, you can. I've done that before. I mean, typically, well, it depends on what you're doing. You can. So unlike Angular, or at least Angular 1, Vue plays just fine with jQuery. You can have, in that original app that I was on at Outcome, we used jQuery, and we would call jQuery functions when needed. The only time that we really used it was we had a data table that was written in jQuery, and we'd call functions on that. But yeah, you could. Vue comes with an animation library built in. So I know jQuery is used a lot in animations. Vue has most of your standard animations built in. I don't have any examples of that tonight, but Vue's documentation is probably some of the easiest to navigate through that I've encountered. So I was at the end of it, I was going to say check it out, but definitely check out their documentation if you want. If you want to see everything they can do, this is just like some of the things that hooked me initially. And I think the animation stuff is kind of new, actually. It's a 2.5. So we went over single file components, so that's good. So I wanted to quickly, so Vue has a state management system that you can get called Vuex. It's based on Redux and Flux and Elm architecture. In fact, the guys who worked on Redux and Flux helped Evan and I can't remember the other guy's name who came up, built out Vuex, helped them heavily to design it and build it out. You guys see it, but Vuex lives sort of where in this area here. So Vue component, the way that it works is you would put all of your shared data inside of the store, right? Inside of the data store. So shared data meaning, things that other components might want to access that maybe aren't child components of something that data is being set on or something like that. And what's nice is that there's only one way to change this data. You can't just go into the store and change data with all kinds of willy-nilly. You have to either commit to the store or dispatch to the store, which is all event-driven. So it follows Vue's, sort of event stop data down. And I have an example of this. What's cool about Vuex and is different from Flux or Redux is that it's supported by the Vue core devs, and it's updated with Vue library. So what that means is it's officially supported. Like they work on it. It's not part of Vue's core library. But when Vue's core library updates to say 2.6, Vuex will be updated to incorporate any new changes that it needs to. What's nice about that is that you don't have to rely on the mercy of whomever is keeping that, like whoever is keeping it up to date to be up to date with what's going on. The same can be said for Vue Router, which is Vue's routing solution. It's sort of a first-party library. It's kept up to date with the core library. You guys actually saw an app that used the Vuex, Vue Data Store. I'll show you that really quick because it's kind of neat. There's all tabs. And that is Vuex Vue Router. So showed you guys this a little bit earlier, and we have this import store from store. We also have import router from router. I'm going to go over both of these right now. So store, if you guys you guys are familiar with the syntax, right? Or yeah, okay, cool. So stores are Vuex store. So if we look at store, so you have to, this is some kind of like a special syntax for Vue. Basically, when you register, not all, but most outside plugin libraries with Vue, you have to tell Vue to use that library. That's the first thing you do. And then Vue knows like, oh, okay, cool, I'm using Vuex. What that does is allows you to, when you're bootstrapping your Vue instance, pass it the store. And it will hook up this store. It puts it on its instance of this so that you can access it. So it adds it as its own property. And so this is a Vue store. You have state. State is the state of the app, your data. And then you have mutations and you have actions. All right, so mutations and actions is the difference here. They both contain functions. Mutations are how you directly change data on the store. You can't just say this.state.counter equals 1. It won't let you do that. In fact, it'll throw an error. You have to say, you have to commit something to the store. I mean that very literally. What that looks like is this. So this is the store that I was just showing you. It's been registered with this. When I bootstrapped the app, I told it about the store. You have to say you commit things. When you commit things, you pass it a string. This basically goes through what I like to think of as an internal message bus. The store listens for, it knows about its mutations. It listens for the name of one of its mutations. And when it hears one, it fires that mutation. It does the thing. You can absolutely pass arguments to this if you want to, if you have arguments to pass to it. And when you do that inside of the store on the function, you just accept those arguments next to state. And then you can do whatever you want with those. State here is a special argument that is always the first one passed in. What state is basically referring to the state of this store. So that will always be the first argument implicitly passed in, so that you can actually get the data that's on the state of the store and do whatever you want with it. Actions are another way to change data in the store. They come with context, which you can think of as a reference to state and mutations on the store. So context is basically the context of the current store I'm in. And then here I'm passing in a value, so that would be inside of this one. So in order to commit things to, or in order to activate an action, you, instead of commit, you dispatch. You might be wondering, like, why the hell are there two ways to do this? Why would I need this? Why wouldn't I just use the commit? Okay, so the reason that there are two ways to do this is that typically sort of the way that Vue developers write their apps, the standard I should say, is that inside of actions is where you will do all of your data manipulation before you commit it to the store. The mutation should be as simple as possible. They should basically just set data. You can think of mutations as just like stupid data setters. Actions are where the business logic usually happens. The reason for this is because actions natively support promises, meaning that when I do this dispatch, if I want something to happen once I know that the data has been dispatched to the store, it has been set, I can do this. Pass it a function, right? And that it's natively supported, sort of that promise syntax there. The mutations do not support that, so they're synchronous. Actions are asynchronous, mutations are synchronous. That's the big difference. And in most modern day applications, you usually want to use the asynchronous ones just because you probably have something you want to do after that data has actually been committed. So the way that I've done this in practice usually has been that in the actions, I'll have some sort of AJAX call that needs to happen to get some data or something and then commit it to the store. Once that AJAX call is done, that's when I want to maybe check to see if that data is there or do something with it. And so that's typically why you'll see most people use dispatch. And even if you don't need the asynchronous nature of it, it's good just to use it anyway, just standard. Always use dispatch, it doesn't hurt. It's one extra step that you have to go through, yes, but if people know, always follow the same standard. I know to look inside of the actions always. Stores can have a couple other attributes too, but for the most part, this is the meat of a store. It's going to be state, mutations, actions. Is there any questions on stores, or else I'll jump into the view router really quick?
So you showed us the set counter to actions. Was there an increment counter call somewhere too? To the
mutation?
Yeah.
Should be inside of counter to increment would be then here.
Okay.
Also, one of the other things you'll see, if you have a store in an app, most computed properties in that case, a lot of times will just be returning something in the store as data that you can access on that particular component. You could, you could take this and make it sort of a data attribute. Problem with that is, then as this updates, these attributes are not reactive, so they wouldn't update with it. You would need a computed property to do that. So really quick, jump into the router. So the Vue has a way of it has a Vue router, so it's basically client-side routing, and you can bring this in. Again, it's supported by Vue.js core devs. It offers a lot of stuff. You can turn on HTML5 history mode, do redirects and aliases, name route. Basically, this Vue router, if you're familiar with Rails routing, was or is heavily influenced by the way that Rails does its routing system. So the Vue router, basically here, if I say take me somewhere, this is actually a new route. Let's see here, slash another. The router's, I think, pretty straightforward in terms of everything it can do. The way that looks is you have this thing called router view. Router view will be replaced by whatever component should be rendered in the current route. You set that up in your index router. That is here. So basically, you give it routes, and you say, here's the path. You can refer to routes by name, and then what component should I render. And so when I navigate to /path, it's going to render hello world. If I go to /another, it's going to render whatever another component is, so on and so forth. There are hooks, there are before and after hooks that you can also include here, but the routers, it's pretty simple, I think, just because a router should be fairly simple, and what you can do in terms of a client-side router. And in the Vue Dev Tools, you actually can see, Vue Dev Tools will tell you, it'll tell you what the router view is rendering currently. So it's telling you that this is the router view. So the router view is nested in app, and this is what it's currently rendering. If I go to take it somewhere, that's going to change to another component. One more Vue Dev Tools thing is, and this is actually, I use this all the time, you can see the Vuex store and the state of it, and you can also see, like I said, it's all message-based, right? So you can see the messages that have been sent. You can actually revert or time travel to them to see what it was at that time. So this is actually really cool for debugging purposes. You can actually really see what was going on step by step in your app.
Okay, so is that a plugin that you love, the Vue Dev Tools?
Yeah, so if you were to go to the Vue's website, they have a link to it. It's just a Chrome plugin. I think they have it for every major browser, as far as I'm aware. And it's just a plugin similar to like Angular's Dev Tools. I'm assuming React has some.
It does.
And yeah, it's just a plugin. And so when you have it, you will actually, in your dev mode, it'll detect that you have a Vue app already, and it'll automatically bring this up and let you click on it and do your thing. I think The last bit of this talk was really going to be sort of, so really quick, Vue has support for Jest if you guys are React devs and you use Jest. There's also Vue test utilities, which is basically just a library that allows you to test Vue components very easily. You can hook into all of their lifecycle hooks. You can mock out a component that has you can mount a component that has child components shallowly, which means that it will stub out all of your child components automatically if you don't need to do anything with them in that test. So you don't have to worry about doing that. And then the typical setup I've seen for testing Vue is Karma, Mocha, and nowadays the Chrome runner, since Chrome has a headless browser now. So and tests work pretty well. Once you get the hang of writing JavaScript tests, you mount the component, you test the methods and everything, and you just have to figure out how you want to write your JavaScript test. And then competition. So what's interesting is that Vue's heavily influenced by React, and a number of React core devs actually helped Evan develop Vue, which I think is really cool. They developed React, Facebook developed React, and a number of those core devs that still work at Facebook and still talk to him, he reached out and they said, yeah, we'll help you develop this. We did it one way, and here's a different way you could do it that might be better. And I think that's really, really cool. So Vue and React actually have a lot in common. In terms of just raw speed, they're comparable. Optimization, like I was saying earlier, the should component update is sort of automatically in each Vue component, as opposed to having to put that in React components. And then the other thing that to consider is JSX, right? Like using JSX is you got to learn that, and in React primarily uses that. You have to learn that, and it's powerful. But when you have a team who varying levels of familiarity with JavaScript or front-end development, having something that looks much more like just regular old HTML and JavaScript and CSS is also very powerful. And because you can do most of the same things in React that you can do in Vue, in fact, the only thing I've seen that you can't really do between the two is that React has React Native and Vue doesn't really have anything that combats that. So I typically tell people, like, when it comes to the competition, React and Vue are very, very similar. And the main thing that I tell people is, why should you use Vue? Well, if you're looking at making a new application or a project, definitely give Vue a try. You're going to like it. I like it. I think it's much simpler than React, from the little bit I've tried to jump into. If you have an application already written in some other framework and you don't have, there's no real reason for you to rewrite it, then you're probably not going to, there's no reason for you to introduce Vue into your application unless you're introducing it in such a way that in the future you're going to be rewriting most of the app in Vue. If you're already using React, you're probably fine, unless you want to just rewrite everything in Vue. If you want to introduce little Vue apps into your main application, absolutely do that. Vue can handle it. You don't, like I said, you don't even need a build tool for it. You can just introduce. Vue also has the scope CSS, which I think is really cool, and single file components. If you want to use that, you do have to use single file components, which means you do have to introduce something like Webpack to compile down. React isn't, React Native, which is something that Vue is trying to get up to with something called, I think it's called Weeks. I actually don't know if it's Wix or Weeks or Wiz, I don't know. But it's supported by Alibaba Group, so it is getting up there and off the ground, but it's still early in alpha. I tried to use it a couple months ago and I couldn't even get it to start. So, Vue is a lot simpler in design and API than a lot of other frameworks. Angular comes to the front of mine. And you can go through their documentation in about a day. That's what I was saying. It's super easy to pick up. But I didn't think it was. I thought they were lying to me that it was that simple. I assumed that the documentation was missing a lot of stuff when I first started learning it, because it's they can't have documented it all so well in such a way that I understood it, and it's all here. But it is. And what's great about that is that that means that you can understand what's going on as long as you understand JavaScript, because it leverages a lot of the power of JavaScript. And then you can understand what the framework is doing and not have to worry about a lot of overhead and understanding, well, they made this decision because of blah, blah, blah. It's just they've made a lot of upfront decisions. They tell you about them, and they tell you about all the caveats they have, big bold letters on their website. And that's about it for this. I want to have questions. I'll also be, I think, around for probably a drink or two before heading back into the city at, I guess, what was that place? Bulldog?
Yeah.
But I'm also here. Ask me questions. I know we ran over time, but thank you for indulging me. And I know I kind of sped through that, but, and I don't have, that was the last slide. I was going to put up a slide with my contact info, but I can give that around if anybody wants it. I'm on the what is it? The software?
Craftsmanship again.
That one, I'm on that. We also have, there's a Chicago Vue.js Slack channel that we have. I can send that to Ryan, and then, or actually I can just put it in that group if you guys are in that group. And you can find me on Twitter, but I don't tweet. But yeah, questions, comments, concerns?
When I hear framework and user interface, I think widgets and pre-built user interface objects. Does Vue provide a library for that, or does it provide wrappers around other things?
Vue doesn't provide one themselves, but there are plenty of libraries built with Vue that do provide that. So one of the ones I really like to use is called
So like buttons and data entry boxes and
yes.
all that stuff.
Actually, I have them do this one. I like to use one called Element.io, I want to say, which provides you with a bunch of stuff. If I can find my... So yeah, Element UI. And I just imported a couple things, but basically all of your form controls, this library provides you just wrapped all of your normal form controls inside of Vue, so you can do some cool things with them. And one of the ones I like is the number control, because it actually, you have settings that you could say don't accept negative numbers or decimals and stuff like that. So Vue usually wants you to build them yourself. It doesn't actually force you into one. It's not like jQuery UI or anything like that.
You said it was a simpler framework. Is there some upper limit of complexity you would avoid, or it's like a simple application to
Not that I've encountered.
read out of a database and get input from a user is doable?
It's all doable. We'll put it this way. GitLab uses Vue as their front-end technology.
Oh, okay.
So if you want to see some really cool and interesting ways to use Vue, definitely go check out their source code.
One last one.
Yeah.
Is there any support for dynamic components? You had mentioned something about registering things before certain things load.
When you say dynamic components, you mean adding things to the page after the page is
Yeah.
loaded? Yes.
Like if I pull some information out of a database and then I decide what buttons I want to show.
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways you could do that, but yes, you could either just have Vue has native, sort of showing and hiding of things. Actually, they have something called, it's an if-else statement, and what that does is you set it to a property saying, let's say you haven't loaded the data yet, so you have a property that says this data loaded equals false. You have some HTML that you have those buttons that you want to render when the data is loaded. So you say, VF data loaded. It will not render that HTML until that Boolean value is true, and then it'll actually render that HTML. So when I say render, I mean the HTML is not even on the page.
Right, but so it sounds like you have to have some code in place ahead of time that's just hidden, or as opposed to literally just inventing a component on the fly.
I see. Yeah, so yes, you do have to have some code in place. So if you're just downloading a straight component from a server, you probably would. You probably would actually. I mean, you would probably know what that component looks like beforehand. I'm assuming. Either put it in a list. You'd have sort of like a template component.
So you'd have to download what you need.
Because would you? So in this scenario, would you be downloading straight HTML, or would you just be downloading data to populate some HTML?
Well, I'm not even going that deep. I'm just saying, like I go query, I go pull a record out of a database, and
You want to show it on
the
page?
record's got an option that says this needs a color button.
Uh-huh.
But I don't really care ahead of time whether it's a color button. It may have a different connotation. It may have its own code. So there'd be a link to some code that you'd get someplace else.
You can do, I think, half of what you're saying, and then the other half might be a little bit more dynamic than what Vue can handle in
I
terms
mean,
of.
ideally, if it could just
everything
pull the
else.
whole component ready to go out of something, that would be workable too.
Yeah, well, actually, with Vue Next Tick, I've never done that, but now I'm gonna have to do that because now I'm thinking that there probably is a way to do that. And because Vue exposes you to something called Next Tick, which basically forces it to render everything essentially. And so in that case, you probably want that to happen because if you're downloading a straight component and attaching it to the page, Vue doesn't know about any of it yet until you tell Vue, hey, re-render yourself, and then it'll pick it up.
Cool. Good enough. Thanks.
So one of the complaints I've heard about React is that you spend a lot of time evaluating and auditioning libraries to see, like, well, what should my router be? What should my model layer be? Is there as much of that in Vue, or is it kind of like, well, just use the standard built-in router and no one really deviates from it, or is it less fragmented in that way?
It is less fragmented in that way because Vue Router and Vue Store, Vuex, are treated as first-party libraries. They're not a part of the core library, but because they're supported by the core library and they're updated in tandem, most people just turn to those. So usually that you can use Flux and Redux actually as well. I've not seen that as much, probably because Vuex is pretty similar to those in terms of how it works. And in terms of the router, I think most people just use the Vue router just because it's there and because it is kept in lockstep with the core library. And that is one of the advantages of Vue, is that it is a little bit less fragmented. The disadvantage there is that its ecosystem is not as mature as React's, just because it hasn't been out as long. It's only started picking up steam in the last year, I would say, maybe a year and a half. So, yeah.
Cool. Thank you very much.